And welcome. This upcoming plenary session will engage a broad and urgent question. How do we understand trauma, emotion, and healing when we expand our field of vision beyond the human alone? Across disciplines, from neuroscience and anthropology to ethics and clinical practice, we're increasingly called to think with, rather than merely about, other animals, and to take seriously their emotional lives, vulnerabilities, and capacities for connection. The two lectures we will hear in this session offer complementary perspectives on human-animal relationship. Together, they invite us to move beyond anthropocentric assumptions and to consider animals not as therapeutic tools or metaphors, but as subjects with lived experience, with agency and emotional worlds of their own. The dialogue between scientific insight, emotional understanding, and ethical reflection opens a rich space for rethinking responsibility, healing, and shared existence across species. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to post your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the session. We will return to them for discussion following each talk. The Q&A box is in the toolbar below. If you can't see it right now, make sure to push the button with the 3 dots, and then you can choose the Q&A box. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Barbara J. King. Barbara is a biological anthropologist and an internationally recognized scholar whose work has profoundly shaped how we think about the emotional lives of animals and the complex bonds between humans and other species. Across her research and writing, she has explored grief, loss, love, empathy, and social connection in animals, bringing rigorous scientific inquiry together with careful ethical imagination. Her work has helped broaden conversations about trauma and attachment beyond the human, offering perspectives that are deeply relevant to therapists, researchers, and all of us who engage with animals in contexts of care, vulnerability, and healing. We are very, very fortunate to have her here with us today. Barbara, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Anat, for such a generous introduction, and I'm pleased to be here with all of you. I am speaking to you at the morning, for me, from southeastern Virginia in the United States, and we're on a small patch of land near a river, and that is my shared space in multi-species perspective, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. I'm pleased to be speaking to you about trauma, grief, and love in animals. And I'm going to start with a story. For many years, I thought that it was right and natural that there are certain things that you just don't say to another individual who is suffering from grief or trauma or both together. You listen to them speaking, but you don't say, "Oh, I know what you're going through," because it's impossible to know exactly what someone else is going through. I thought for sure it was far better to say, "I can't imagine your pain, but I express to you my concern and my love." I felt I was giving a gift, a recognition of sorts, that every lived experience of terrible times has its own nature and its own quality of darkness. And then, just last year, I read a memoir by the writer Miriam Toews called A Truce That Is Not Peace. And in this book, she describes what happened when she was walking with a friend who had lost a child to cancer. And the friend was explaining that when someone says to her, "I can't imagine your pain," she feels even more isolated. She feels sad and cut off. And she said, "Stay with me. You can imagine. Try to imagine." That's what this friend wanted. And at that moment, my head kind of snapped around and I began to think, differently. I began to think about bringing together scientific evidence and a reasonable imagination to take up a multi-species lens on grief and love and trauma and resilience. And so this afternoon, my thesis is really in two parts. First, it is still relatively rare that grief experiences and trauma experiences in the other than human world are taken seriously and explored deeply. We here know that these things are real, whether it's grief or a clinical diagnosis in an animal of PTSD. And I have come to believe that we must bring our imagination to these questions in certain ways that I will be describing for you. Second, when we think about resilience, we know that it is often considered a wholly admirable thing, a wholly admirable trait in an individual, and even more importantly, the valuable goal for us collectively to strive for. This is true for humans, although I'll be focusing on other than human animals. And certainly we can recognize very positive aspects of resilience. But I would like to talk about why I think it's important to be very cautious in setting this as a primary goal. So let's talk a little bit about resilience. In a paper 6 years ago, F. Basile et al. Mentioned the 2014 definition offered by the American Psychological Association of resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, or significant sources of stress. And these authors went on to note that resilience is conceived as a dynamic developmental process involving the achievement of positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. Thus, resilience is not a unique ability, but rather a set of capacities of a system put in place to absorb a disturbance and to reorganize while trying to retain the same function, structure, and identity. And before taking up a more critical lens, I do want to suggest that, of course, for some individual animals, finding ways to embody resilience can be helpful. We may know the story of Owen and Mazet, one of my favorite stories of cross-species friendship. In 2014, there was, as we know, a terrible tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Owen was a young hippopotamus at the time who was swept away from land and his mother out to a sandbar where he was rescued and brought to a Kenyan rescue rehabilitation park for animals. And at that point, Owen met Mazet, who was 130 years old. He was and is a giant tortoise. And the two of them found a way to relate with each other that I think is well described as resilience on the part of Owen following a trauma. They developed a remarkable attunement to each other and a cross-species communication program where, for example, if Owen walking behind Mazet wanted Mazet to go right, he would nip Mazet's right back leg and left for left. They were together for decades and they became a very important symbol of remarkable friendship that also could reasonably be thought of as resilience in the face of a natural disaster. I myself have written about resilience in a positive manner. My husband and I have spent many years rescuing cats who otherwise would be homeless. Two of the cats we rescued were Kaylee and Haley, who were entirely white with blue eyes, which rendered them extra susceptible to certain types of cancer. Kaylee, who you see here on the left, weathered many difficult experiences in her life, from the death of her very close companion, her sister Haley, on the right, to an extremely complex femur fracture, to an escape from us when she had this fracture that led us to search for her in the winter for a full year and recover her, filthy, thin, and near starved. And I'd like to read you a couple of paragraphs of what I published in an online magazine called Psyche. Indoors again, Kaylee not only healed but warmed to living with us, reclining on our sunroom couch or inside a woven basket, prancing in place as we rubbed her neck. This summer, 13 years after she came to us, she died of abdominal cancer. Kaylee had her particular pleasures. She loved and she grieved. She acted with strength and courage when faced with life challenges. I believe in part because she learned over time from those life experiences how to be resilient. And I went on to argue that it's a myth that other than human animals inevitably live moment to moment. We see that all the time in therapeutic contexts, in rescue contexts, in sanctuary contexts, that animals do not just live in the moment. But I think of my words now as I think back on Kaylee. Kaylee is pictured underneath the picnic table here in sight of her sister Haley, whom we laid out in death on a tarp for other animals to come and see and have closure. It's not wrong to say that Kaylee was resilient, but I myself created a kind of narrative arc for her in which resilience was the desired end product and desired triumph. But I want to ask a different question now. Can we see and know and imagine something of animals' experiences like Kaylee's through her life that may help us move beyond a praising or reifying of resilience, which at times imposes terrible costs on the victim? We know that resilience is often desired in animals within highly commodified systems that cause harm to animals. After all, if an animal is to be exploited within an industry such as the biomedical industry or the food industry, resilience is necessary to ensure continued extracted productivity. Whether the animal is asked to give over her own body to reproducing offspring, or to endure experimentation herself, or perhaps to have her life taken altogether. Let's look again at that same paper by Bazal et al., where I gave you the definition of resilience. They go on to say the nervous system, as well as other systems, are highly dynamic structures that show plasticity throughout life. And having the opportunity to act on this plasticity to modify resilience to stressors could be an asset, not only to improve animal welfare, but also to increase livestock productivity or the quality of the food derived from them. So we must understand that as natural as it may be to speak of resilience in certain contexts as a good and positive thing, we must realize that there are hidden costs often to individual animals that are exhausting costs or involve physical or emotional pain that may be hidden from view. And as a brief aside, as a human being who 12 years ago went through robot-assisted surgery and many rounds of chemotherapy and many more rounds of radiation when I had a challenging cancer, I honestly didn't want to hear one more time how resilient I was being. It was well meant, but there are hidden costs to that. Now back to other animals. I think that any praising of individual resistance must be embedded in structural systemic analysis. At the individual level, we can think of a deeper recovery of self, a focus on animal well-being, for example. This slide comes from my colleague and friend, Dr. Liv Baker, who, as you see, takes a very comprehensive approach to thinking about what animal well-being is. Physical health, nutrition, certainly, but also all kinds of things like environmental engagement, self-expression, emotional valences, learning, exploration, culture, and so forth. At a societal level, especially when the causes of pain are anthropogenic, a transformation of the brutality that's causing the pain in the first place is obviously key. And in both situations, these are highly relational processes. They require patience, caring, and love. So I'd like to wind back a little bit and take a moment to talk about what I have worked on for the last 12 years, and that is the expression of emotion in animals with a certain focus on grief. My claim is not that every case that's documented of animal grief is necessarily wrapped up in trauma, but that we should open our mind to that question of when it may be. In this year, it's highly scientifically credible to assert that a wide variety of mammals and birds express profound emotions as they live their lives every day. Many of you will recognize that we may still be accused of anthropomorphism, and that is, of course, the inappropriate projection of human qualities onto other animals. But we are well beyond that now, and we know from scientific evidence of the expression of love and grief in other animals. The way that I define grief as a visible expression of emotion is to look for social withdrawal, altered eating, sleeping, moving, postural, vocal, or facial cues that are specific to the species in question. Certainly, this expression is highly variable in both inter and intra-specific ways. It depends on many things like individual personality, quality and depth of relationship, and the sociality of the species to begin with. And clearly, we must look beyond anthropocentric standards when we are doing this work. Now, many examples have become pretty famous over time. And if anyone has heard me talk before, you know that I will talk about elephants. For example, the fallen elephant here is named Eleanor, and her friend, another matriarch, is attempting to right her at first, but then realizes that Eleanor has in fact died and carries out a vigil with standing over the body, rocking over the body, and for a whole week, elephants from 5 different families came to do this. Perhaps the most famous recent example of grief in animals comes from the orca Tahlequah, who really riveted the world when from her pod in the Salish Sea in the waters off of western United States and Canada, she carried out what we now call her 2 grief swims, first and most famously in the summer of 2018 with her dead daughter on her body. As you see here, she swam, refusing to break that connection with her daughter for 1,000 miles over 17 days, and then did a brief repeat with another offspring in the winter of 2024 to 25. I think that the world, in a certain way, apart from people like us who do this sort of thing, woke up to the idea of orca and cetacean grief in 2018. What Tahlequah did became a touch point, not only in science, but in art. There was an explosion of film and dance and community events with schools that really reflected upon the fact that a mammalian mother was expressing sorrow in a way that should not and could not be mistaken for just an expression of stress. And we also know, of course, that Tahlequah was in no way unique among cetaceans in cetacean culture. There are whole papers that really bring together whale and dolphin behavioral responses to death, in some cases using that distancing language, in other cases repeatedly using the words grief and grieving for some of the observations. So when I give examples, we understand that these are embedded in much richer databases now across many mammals. I think very frequently about the donkey Lena. This photograph really is so evocative. She lived with her very close friend, a horse named Jake, in a Canadian animal rescue sanctuary. And at a certain point, Jake was humanely euthanized for intractable pain. And the organizers of this sanctuary reached out to me because after Lena observed the burial of Jake in the field during the winter, she would not come in from standing on his grave. She would not return to the barn or eat. This was a very clear example of social withdrawal and alteration of behavioral routine, and it continued for days. She eventually did come back and began a journey of self-recovery, but it was very poignant to me, again, here in a case with a mammal who is not given the same understanding of the level of intelligence and emotion as we find in orcas and in elephants. So there are all kinds of new findings and reflections every year in this field, from a fascinating paper on peccaries that was co-written by an elementary school boy named Dante Descartes, to dairy cows such as Luma, pictured here by documentary filmmaker Andrea Arnold in her wonderful film. I've talked with people who tell me that they're convinced of the existence of grief expression in rattlesnakes. I myself recently watched as a mourning dove was fluttering around the body of his or her mate, another mourning dove crushed in the road by a car. We see and we awaken ourselves to these examples of grief all around us all the time. And I'm always saying that love and grief don't belong to us. We see from the ground up that they are widespread phenomenon. It is not possible to reduce them to anthropomorphism because they don't belong to us humans in the first place. Now, there's so many examples I could talk about, but in terms of new findings, I'd like to focus on one that I find particularly meaningful. This comes from a paper that, as you see, was published in the journal Polar Biology just last year, the lead author being Emily Spurrow. This team of people went to Patagonia and Chile and under very difficult conditions recorded pinniped leopard seal maternal grief in a way that we had not had recorded before. Now, leopard seals are apex predators in the Antarctic. And the observations showed that 2 leopard seal mothers were showing prolonged examples of what I would call grief and what the authors referred to as PAB, or post-mortem attentive behavior. The mother that you see in the screen here is nicknamed Nora, and she has her chin on top of her dead pup, her dead infant. The alphanumeric name given to this female is LSR01. On the 12th day after this infant's death, Nora was observed to continue to lay on top of the body, to protect it, occasionally to nudge it with quote unquote intense focus. The researchers noted that these behaviors continued for 20 days. And of course, we have here an example of researcher worry about anthropomorphism, despite what I have said about it. The retreat to a refusal to talk about grief and to use a very clinical term of post-mortem attentive behavior. But I might really want to ask, how likely is it that a pinniped mother, a highly intelligent mammal, would carry out all of these behaviors for so long in a complete absence of any emotion? Yes, scientifically it is possible. To assume it, though, embraces what Franz de Waal used to call anthropodenial, the a priori denial to other animals, the profound experiences that we have. And that is straight up human exceptionalism. Even taking into account the maternal nudging of the body, I find it extremely unlikely that Nora didn't understand that her newborn had died, any more that Tahlequah orca wouldn't have understood. The body, in both cases, over 17 days or 20 days, would have emitted all kinds of clear signals of what are called non-functionality and irreversibility. These are terms that I take from the new emerging field of evolutionary thanatology, and particularly from the work of Suzanne Monceau. Non-functionality, of course, indicates that there's no sign of life in the body, and irreversibility, suggesting that there's no sign that there's going to be a sudden reversal in this lack of functionality. It is not tenable to suggest that this attentive, smart mother would be unaware of death for 17 days or 20 days. Discussing this leopard seal information, a reporter asked me a salient question. What might be the emotional effects on Nora? She actually endured a third loss in 2024. 3 offspring had died. And as a researcher and as a mammalian mother, I can only wonder and imagine what effects this may have. Of course, we should keep collecting and sharing data to build up databases about grief, but we should also start connecting those animals' experiences to questions of trauma that are so well known in other contexts. Certainly, we can think of recorded trauma in animals. Anyone who works at a sanctuary or rescue organization knows this. We know that elephant juveniles in Kenya have been observed to undergo night after night violent nightmares after watching their family being killed by poachers. I've had experience with a cat who lost her only human being in her life and was so traumatized by fear, grief, and sadness that she lashed out and needed years of therapy and medication before recovering herself and her sense of well-being. And of course, we know that when animals are subjected to the sights and sounds of terrible environments, terrible shared spaces in war, biomedical research, or slaughterhouses, they are going to have experiences of trauma. I show here a movie called Checkpoint Zoo that is particularly evocative regarding animals in war, in this case in Ukraine. Clearly, the answer here does not rest with a goal of individual resilience. We need to probe and push and imagine and tell the world that harms to humans are harms to all kinds of beings who think and feel and love and sorrow. Now, let me talk a little bit about bringing the word imagination into the conversation. I don't mean to signal, of course, any neglect of science or scientific evidence. On the contrary, it centers such evidence and uses scientifically informed imagination to ask, what can we learn from enlarging our gaze on these topics to include other animals? Can we understand something more of what it means to be an orca, a cow, a cat, a donkey, a duck? Can we think beyond mammals? Can we think beyond birds? What about shared spaces with invertebrates? Now, the poster child of invertebrate cognition, emotion, feeling, and relationality has become the octopus. We know quite a bit now about the distributed cognition in octopus arms. Octopuses obviously have a brain, but they also have cognitive powers in each of their 8 arms. We know that they flash emotion on their skin. We know that if you induce injury in them, as some researchers insist upon doing, they cradle that site of injury and feel better when anesthesia is put in the water. We also know that increasingly here are invertebrate animals thought to be food. We know that they are under constant assault, not only from the biomedical research, but from an attempt to turn octopus food into a large industry. I have shared spaces with octopuses. I have a particular love of them. And yet you will notice in this shared space where I was invited to become a sort of enrichment object for a giant Pacific octopus known as the Professor, in a very good aquarium in New England in the United States, I have the ability to leave the shared space at the end of the encounter, and the individual octopus most definitely does not. I will note, however, that we left it up to this male called the Professor whether he wanted to contact me or not. This was his choice. He did choose to do so, and for me, it was a thrilling moment. I hope it was for him as well. This was considered to be, by the aquarist, a good experience for the octopus. Now, I never expected to take on a role of octopus activist in my life, but it is important for us to begin to push and to think beyond mammals and birds. And in this regard, I want to talk about a book that was published earlier this year. This is a book by Mandy Suzanne Wong called Daughter of Mother of Pearl. And she records the experience of marine invertebrates such as sea stars and mussels and starfish, who are often seen by humans as virtually senseless. not comprehended certainly as beings who might experience emotion. She does describe the lives of these invertebrate organisms by citing some peer-reviewed scientific work. But she also includes a chapter in which she explicitly tells us we must use our imagination in combination with science when secrets elude us about individual lives. I did publish a review of this book in Science Magazine, and I want to read you a section of that review, which also quotes from the book. Wang portrays creatures who suffer, sending a message to laboratory researchers who still deny invertebrate pain. In the highly affecting essay she calls Fragment/Lamentations, she describes the experience of a mussel suddenly extracted from their watery home. Here is Wang. Quote, "You resist, flying through the air in ways that you would never have believed, never in your life. The hook rips out of you a searing flash of pain, bits of your flesh tossed overboard as you were thrown down on the deck," unquote. This is me again. Readers who meet this passage with skepticism, how could a mussel's nervous system permit a pain experience, are exactly the readers Wang wishes to engage. In her haunting chapter, Mollusks, Mirrors, and Dreams, she argues that when dealing with unknown and to some extent unknowable animals, imagination may produce truths that are more potent and essential than facts. Now, I know some will say this is dangerous ground. How can you mix what is scientifically known with what is imagined? But I'm not, of course, advocating some willy-nilly grabbing of whimsy, some Disney fantasy of other lives. Instead, we want to think about the experience animals have from the ground up and come back to that question of how do we help animals to heal without focusing only on resilience. We can ask questions of an individual animal. What calms the animal who is in trauma? What act of co-regulation between a human and an animal or two animals help that individual return to herself, to her mind and her habits? How do we listen and look to see what the animal embraces and rejects on an everyday basis? How do we always remind ourselves and put that reminder into action that other than human animals are, of course, not voiceless? And we had a very interesting reflection on what voice means as the conference opened. But we also are continuously told by animal activists, stand up for the voiceless. And that is something that I think we must resist, that slogan. And then at the societal level, what is necessary to transform the infliction of the trauma in the first place? Of course, I am not coming to you this afternoon with answers about huge societal questions. I wish I could. But as a first step, valorizing animal resilience is not the answer any more than holding up Israeli resilience, Palestinian resilience, Ukrainian resilience, on and on, is an answer to suffering. We may look to recovery through care, of course. We may look to transformation to prevent the suffering in the first place, but only if we can see and know and imagine first in combination and be both rigorous and fearless in language when we describe other animals' lives, when we don't retreat to clinical phrases that hide what is actually going on. And I absolutely think that these two things may co-occur together, the rigor and the fearlessness. To put it plainly, my life as a scholar coexists with my life as an animal advocate and animal activist. Animal lives are threaded through my whole life, personally and professionally, and I see no troubling necessarily about doing both if we take care to think about what we're doing and to seek alternative explanations always. This is not uncommon in my field of anthropology to do both together. And I take a panel here from a book that I love. This is a book by anthropologist Elise Waterston and illustrator Charlotte Cordin in their book called Light in Dark Times. And the panel says, engaged anthropologists ask, what can my discipline offer the world in order to address a wide range of issues of profound social importance? Well, of course, we want to realize that profound social importance includes other than human animals. And in the time that I have left, I want to just talk about that a little more and to ask, what if we made our knowledge of animal grief and animal trauma work for animals? And one example that is close to my heart has to do with primates, specifically monkeys. And we know that monkeys ranging from macaques and baboons to marmosets may grieve. We have that in the peer-reviewed literature. We also know that the biomedical industry is very fond of using these animals in the US and elsewhere, keeping tens and tens of thousands of animals as breeders to produce small infants that grow up to become subjects of invasive experiments. And we know, obviously, that many more animals are considered food resources for humans. So I want to show you a difficult slide. This is a monkey, a rhesus macaque, who should be presenting to you with a very full and brown coat. She was held for years in a laboratory in the United States. You can see that her cage is very barren. This mirror on the front of it is considered to be an enrichment object. She has plucked hair over her entire body out as a result of her stress. You will notice that she's clutching an infant to her body. She was used as an experimental breeder for many years until she herself was killed in a Zika experiment, the disease Zika. And I remember her because I was involved with a team of people attempting to save her, and we did not save her. And we know that there has to be a role for the recognition of the grief that she felt when her infants were taken from her. The fact that had she been living as she was meant to be living, she would have been living in a network of profound social ties. So is there a role for the recognition of this in contesting the treatment of these animals, the social networks of animals who are disrupted in so many ways? I believe there are benefits to invoking emotional capacities of animals when we attempt to repair the costs of human exceptionalism for other animals. The essayist Ross Gay has written that, quote, grief is the metabolization of change, and, quote, the first wisdom of grief is that everything is connected. I have found that there's something profound that touches people when they think about the experience of grief in other animals and offers a window and an invitation on how to make our circle of moral compassion enlarge. I want to be very clear that probing the limits of visibly expressed animal grief, which of course I believe emerges from friendship and love, is important too. I do not suggest that non-grieving animals should be denied our care and our compassion at all. And perhaps we are circling back here to sea stars and mussels and starfish. I don't know. I do know that the kinds of questions that all of you are asking and grappling with today and tomorrow are centrally important for this melding of scholarship and activism and thinking beyond resilience. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that while shared spaces are obviously very often fraught, we also know, and we will hear more about, how they can be incredibly positive, bringing together multi-species senses of attunement and mutuality. My life is full of gifts from other beings in the shared space that I inhabit here. And I come back again to that remark I made at the very beginning about my shared space, my small patch of land in Virginia. And I just want to show you how our shared spaces are, of course, everywhere. They're not only sites of pain or sites of sanctuary healing, but they're all around us. We're fortunate enough in my backyard to have wildlife coming every day. And I understand that there are predators and prey here. This is not a pristine area that is all about safety and only safety. We see here a hawk with a dark shape underneath her body, and that is a bird that this hawk has killed. There was one day when I was contemplating these matters and reading in my sunroom, and a very large vulture came to look at me in my window. This is a black vulture who, of course, is a scavenger and very present around death. But there's also life in my yard. There are 50 species of birds that come through the year, like this northern flicker. There are beautiful snakes, and we try to make the yard very welcoming for all of these individuals. Invertebrates also. There's examples of father and son pairs of birds and mother and son pairs of birds. There's new life all the time as we have native box turtles mating in our yard. So our shared spaces are sites of love as well as everything else that I have spoken about today. And I want to, first of all, before moving on to the Q&A, give a very grateful shout out to the organizers for so much work over the last months. And I would specifically wish to thank Gal Hakim for great, patient, kind, and efficient communication. And here you see my email address and my website. Please do feel free to reach out individually. And thank you so much for the kind attention, and we will move on now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor King, for this deeply moving and illuminating talk.